Hello everyone, and we're going to get stuck in on looking at a next chunk of 4 economic reforms that China is undertaking. Okay, so our next 4 areas that we're going to look at break down firstly to labour market reforms. Now, China, of course, needs to make sure that they free up their labour market, that they remove that potential supply side constraint of factor immobility, i.e. that the potential for rural workers to not want to actually move into larger cities. China needs to drive that process forward. There's a number of ways that they're considering in doing this. Firstly, reforms of the hukou system. Okay, now the hukou system is the system of workers' rights, which entitles people to free public services in the locality where their mother came from. Okay, now that means for a migrant worker moving to Shanghai or Beijing or Chongqing or any of those large, very large cities, those economic powerhouses, it means that they will not be entitled to those public services, and their children won't be entitled, and so on. So that really does pose a problem for urbanisation. So of course the hukou system does need to be looked at with regard to this. Okay, there's also the need possibly to consider a minimum wage to ensure that there is less exploitation of those migrant labourers as they move into those powerful economic cities. Okay, so that's something else. Further to that, China has also fairly recently announced that for foreign workers that are highly skilled, they're prepared to offer 10-year visas. So again, freeing up the labour market to ensure that China can develop from certain human capital transfers, thereby employing some of the best people from around the world, okay, in a globalised labour market. Okay, moving on to our next point here about the institutional reforms. Now, we saw within China's 5-year plan that they are trying to move to a more entrepreneurial culture and entrepreneurial climate, and inspire people to actually want to set up their own businesses. Now, you need, of course, to ensure that the incentives are right there. So one of the key institutional reforms that China need to look at is intellectual property legislation and ensuring that that is really tightened up. If you do a little search for Lepin Lego, then you'll see exactly what we're talking about here. Now, Lepin is a company which time and again seems to take Lego designs and recreate them for the Chinese market. So things like that, and involving the international community and international businesses in the process of that IP legislation is also important. It's also about improving, for instance, corporate governance. So to ensure that a leader of a chief executive of a large firm is really subject to scrutiny and held accountable to good corporate governance from within his organisation, so that there is a focus on the longer term health of the business, and it's not necessarily just about a short-termist outlook. So it's more about driving the longer term growth of those companies. Okay, so those are some of the institutional reforms that they may well look at there. Okay, moving on, looking at the financial system, because many state-owned enterprises dominate the financial system, it does mean that interest rates are controlled to some degree, particularly when lending is directed to other state-owned enterprises. Now, there is perhaps a need there to liberalise this financial system to ensure that there's market-determined interest rates, for instance. Okay, now that may enable consumers to actually benefit more with any savings that they have by getting slightly better returns on them in terms of the interest they actually get. And it may also help to remove some of the vested interests that lie within the financial system. So rather than just lending to state-owned enterprises, but focusing on companies that actually have the potential to grow and do well in the future. Okay, so that may help to improve the allocation of capital in the Chinese economy. Something else which is also relevant is encouraging other firms to grow, so startup firms to actually get bigger, so ensuring that there is the right sort of capital available for those firms to expand, and should they want to actually list themselves on the Chinese stock market. So to conduct a initial public offering, having their shares on the stock market enables them to, of course, obtain more capital, and it also subjects them to scrutiny as well. Okay, both within their share price and the need to actually report to their shareholders every 3 months or so. Okay, final category we've got here. It's just about the state-owned enterprise reforms. It's worth noting that many SOEs do actually operate in markets such as utilities, where profits are generally relatively low. So it's worth just bearing that in mind. So that can be a clear reason for, when you compare SOE and private sector firms, why SOE performance is poor. But of course there are some state-owned enterprises that are considered to be bloated and inefficient and loss-making and so on. Okay, so those firms are likely to be subjected to the need to actually make profits. Okay, and I believe that has actually been demanded, that they actually are now profitable. So could we see the closure of some of these firms that are making losses? Well, that's debatable. I think it's more likely, certainly in the shorter term, that they would move towards more of a sort of mixed ownership-based system under partial privatisation, and then they may well have to list them on the stock market, again holding them to account to ensure that they are performing as well as they should. Further to that, we've also seen the need for allowing both foreign and domestic firms to compete with those state-owned enterprises to ensure that they don't just have a pure monopoly in those markets. Okay, so as I've said, we've looked at 8 different areas there, okay, within those 4 overall categories. So the internal reforms, okay, the external reforms, the distributional, and the environmental reforms. Okay, so we can see that there's a lot of overlap between each of these areas, and if you go away and investigate 3 of the 8 that we've considered over the last 2 lessons, find out plenty of information there. Find out about the progress that is or isn't being made in those areas and how successful they're likely to be. What you may want to do from there as well is also think about ranking the importance of these reforms. Which of these reforms do you think is most important? Why is that? It depends a lot on your economic outlook, and there isn't necessarily a right answer there. So if the inequality in China really concerns you, then that might be something. If it's more about the environment and the sustainability of that growth, then you may want to focus on that. Of course, inequality does factor into the sustainability though, so of course there's overlap here. But see what you can produce there. Get back to me if you've got any questions. Okay, thanks a lot, guys.